Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Aron. I am the Calvin and Marilyn Gross Director and President and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West, and I am really thrilled and honored to welcome the brave souls who have made it through the rain. I mean, last night, when we had an event at the Autry last night, and I sort of said I was so pleased that people managed to get through the rain. And today is a lot worse, needless to say. And I know that the people who are, how many of you come from outside Los Angeles, Southern California? Okay, a few. I know you guys are laughing at us that we allow what in other places would be called rain to sort of throw off the entire city's equilibrium. But for those of you who are from Los Angeles, it's a pleasure to have you here. It's also my pleasure and honor to begin this program, as we do all programs at the Autry, by acknowledging that the Autry's, certainly its Griffith Park campus, sits on the unceded territories of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, and that we recognize them as the traditional land caretakers, and we pay honor and respect to their elders and ancestors, past, and relations past, present, and emerging. And as I always do, when I deliver that land acknowledgement, I emphasize that the words in the acknowledgement are essentially identical to a slew of other institutions around the city and county. And I'm looking at some people from La Plaza, and they probably have very much similar land acknowledgement. But what I hope distinguishes the Autry, and what I hope inspires others, is not the words, but the deeds. That actions speak louder than words, in this case. And in our case, our actions are consecrated in our management of native collections policy, which oversees how we steward the collections in this building, how we are committed to collaboration, consultation, and consent of native source communities, and how we care for, how we exhibit, to whom we'll loan, how researchers will or will not get access. And that sort of also is reflected in this program today. Certainly the Marshall McKay Seminar for Empowering Native Knowledge is certainly very much in that vein, as is, and I hope you're all going to join us this afternoon, later this afternoon, this evening, for the grand opening celebration of the amazing exhibition, Creative Continuities, Family Pride and Community in Native Art. And I actually got the subtitle right, I think, today. Okay. We'll see if Joe can remember the subtitle in a moment. In any case, it is really, it's important, I think, first to pay our respects also to Marshall McKay, for whom this seminar is named. Marshall McKay was, of course, the tribal chair of the Yoshidehé Winton Nation. He was also the first Native American chair of the Autry's Board of Trustees. And in both those roles, I think he played a transformative role across California and institutionally at the Autry in transforming and revitalizing Native cultures and Native knowledge. And so it's really fitting, I think, that we have created now this seminar, and this is the fourth iteration of it, to sort of honor that legacy and to continue the work of empowering Native knowledge. It's also, I think, important for me here right up front to thank Yuhavi, if they kept it at San Manuel, it would be a lot easier for me to say. The Yuhaviatam band of San Manuel, I've garbled it already, the Yuhaviatam of San Manuel Nation band, for their generous support of lots of things we do at the Autry, but in particular their generous support of this Marshall McKay seminar, which allows us not only to host this magnificent venue here, a magnificent event here, but also to live stream it to Native communities across the country, and to then disseminate the proceedings in a publication often that really, I think, widens the scope that we do here. So I guess the final thanks I'll offer here is to the artists who made this show, and you'll hear from them over the course of today's proceedings, and to Joe Horscapture. for his role in creating this seminar and in overseeing the curation of the Creative Continuities exhibition. Joe often jokes that we don't hire people at the Autry, we just give them additional titles. He has many. He is our Vice President of Native Collections and Engagement. He is our Amundsen Curator, and he's our Chief Curator. And if he's not careful, we'll add another title to that. But it is really my pleasure now to welcome to the stage Joe Horscapture.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm Joe Horscapture. Thank you everyone for being here today. This year's topic for the Marshall McKay Seminar for Empowering Native Knowledge is Plains Indian Art. We have a full slate of great presenters, and I'm grateful for all of them who came into... Am I hearing things? Oh, okay. We'll try this again. We have a full slate of speakers. Thank you everybody for coming into town, and I'm grateful that they are sharing their knowledge with us today. From German novelist Karl May to the film Dances with Wolves, Plains Indian art and culture sits in an unusual place in the mind of most people. It often refers to a stereotypical view of Native America while symbolizing nobility, bravery, and let's be honest, general awesomeness. Today, our presenters will provide us with a deep dive into Plains Indian art and provide us insight into the many works in breaking all stereotypes that you may have. We'll have three important sessions that will present the cultural intricacies of works from their own community, along with different types of work and how work from the past informs contemporary artists today. Capping today's narrative will be a conversation with Rick West on how his father's work changed over time and how that reflects the ongoing story of Plains Indian art. With us today, we've also invited over 80 Native American colleges, tribal museums, and community centers to join us online. We sent them the link, so hopefully they're with us today. If not, this will be recorded and put on our website. So our first presentation today will be by John Lukavic. John is the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of Native Arts at the Denver Art Museum, and he's a good friend of mine, specializing in indigenous arts of North America, where he has organized several exhibitions, including Jeffrey Gibson, Like a Hammer, and Super Indian, Fritz Scholler, 1967 to 1980. John received his PhD in cultural anthropology at the University of Oklahoma, and his doctoral work included working with Southern Cheyenne moccasin makers and with religious leaders in Oklahoma. He is also the Vice President for Native American Art Studies Association. Today, John will provide us, and I'm real sorry about this, John, we'll give him 20 minutes to give us an overview of Plains Indian art. Please welcome John.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone here for coming out today, and for the Autry for having me. As Joe said, I was tasked with giving all the history of Plains arts in 20 minutes. So ask the white guy to do that, right? As Joe said, like, Plains arts are the best, right? So, and you ask any of the artists here, we've got, Absalaga artists, we have Kiowa artists, we have, Lakota artists here, and everyone will tell them that their tribe's art's the best, and that's what we're going to be hearing about today. But how do we even approach Plains arts in 20 minutes? Well, like this work by Black Bear Boson, this is going to be a whirlwind. This work, by the way, is in the Philbrook Arts Collection in Tulsa, Oklahoma. When we talk about, I'm really trying to kind of encapsulate this a little bit as tightly as we possibly can, but I'm going to focus on a few areas. Essentially, when we're looking at Plains arts, you can kind of break things down into three loose categories. So geometric, a narrative, or we could also call it pictorial arts, and then floral arts. Now the florals are kind of the exception to the rule. They're, with the exception of a few tribes, and a few people are going to be talking about those today, so I'm not going to focus as much on the floral part. We're going to talk a little bit about the geometric and then get into really diving deep into the pictorial or narrative, because that's one of the thread lines that actually brings us up to today. But I think it's really important when you're talking about Plains Arts to really talk about the role of women, because women, you know, especially like say in the Cheyenne communities, there were sewing, like referred to as sewing societies or quilling societies or beading societies that not only taught other women how to do the beadwork, but also maintained a level of precision in the work. And you know, in these societies, a woman would make a vow, and they would sit down and they would complete the project that they vowed to create. And the process of making is what was sacred. It wasn't necessarily the final result. So like this teepee liner here with these parallel lines you see, it's the precision, it's the dedication, it's that meditative moment of going through. And if there was an error, an elder woman would come in and cut it out. It would literally, you know, or figuratively count coup on this and cut it out and make them continue on. So that level of kind of quality control really permeates so much of Plains Arts, and one of the things that truly sets it apart. Now, thinking about geometric abstraction, you know, you hear about abstraction being invented in the 20th century by Euro-American artists, but the fact is, geometric abstraction is like, you know, time immemorial for indigenous artists. It's something that is so embedded into the arts that it's, you know, you can't not talk about it. Here you have a hide robe that has what people refer to as a box and border design, like literally because there's a box in it and there's a border on it, but it's essentially kind of looking at, in a very abstract way, the interior part of a buffalo. And so there's teaching moments that can be incorporated into this. So while it is an abstract design, it doesn't mean that it lacks meaning. Similarly, when you look at things like parfleche, which of course is like a, you know, Joe and I talk about this all the time. It's actually more of a processed rawhide envelope in these cases, because parfleche, of course, takes from the French word to repel arrows. But you see these designs on here, and again, you know, you can see them as a form of geometric abstraction, but it doesn't mean that they don't have meaning either. Because for each, you know, various tribes have different styles. And so from a distance, if something like this were kind of strapped on the back of a horse as people are moving, you know, from one place to another, you could see from a distance the design and you can identify what tribe they're from. And so just because something doesn't necessarily have meaning to people who don't have access to that knowledge doesn't mean that it lacks meaning. And so having that foundation and that basis is really important for understanding kind of where things go from there. Now, looking back and focusing mostly on kind of, actually, before I get to that, I should also mention things like this. This is a pair of Southern Cheyenne moccasins, and it has, you know, an abstracted design on it, but the design itself is actually a seating chart for a society teepee. It's meant as a teaching tool, where the wearer, when they look down, you can see kind of like closest to where the ankle would be, kind of this purple area, which would represent the door, a fire in the center. The white spot piece closer to the toe is kind of that sacred space where you know, a bundle or a pipe or something might be. And then the red lines represent where people sit within the teepee. And so, like, again, this is meant as a mnemonic teaching device, but it's encoded in those designs. I also mentioned whirlwinds. Well, the designs that you see on the kind of the top of, and even on the bottom of these moccasins here, represent a dragonfly, and specifically the green darner dragonfly, because in Cheyenne, the word for the green darner dragonfly and the word for a tornado are the same. Because there's this ecological knowledge that it's also incorporated into it. And I could go deeper and deeper into the meaning of the dragonfly, but these are you know, embedded in these abstract designs. But now this is where we're gonna have to kind of go on a roller coaster ride, looking at pictorial art. Pictorial art historically had been, certainly more done by male artists than by female artists. And certainly there was a gender division between them. And of course, as is always the case, people who would now be referred to as two-spirit would be able to bridge these areas and go back and forth between them. So just do want to acknowledge that. But when you look at kind of this, a lot of times this pictorial work is biographical or autobiographical or telling a story and has meaning to it. And you can actually read the scenes depending on how it's constructed. You also get to this idea of winter counts, which are these pictorial recordings of histories, where you can see someone physically painting a winter count now, where each individual design may represent either a year or, in the case of, say, Silverhorn, who's a Kiowa artist, he would depict kind of a winter scene and a summer scene for every year. And there'd be something specific about it that would remind people about what happened that particular year. For example, the date November 13th, 1833, so literally many, many years ago, this particular week, the Leonid meteor shower occurred. And it was recorded not only in, Anglo newspapers, but also in multiple winter counts by artists from various different tribes. You also get to, some people use the term ledger art. Joe and I talk about this all the time. Ledger art is very much a misnomer because the vast majority of it was not actually done on ledger paper. In fact, it comes from that rock art, which was then transferred, either onto hide painting or on muslin, like in this particular example. And again, this is oftentimes autobiographical scenes. This particular one is a drawing on muslin by White Swan, who is one of the 6 Crow Scouts that Lieutenant Colonel George Custer hired to scout the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota camps at what's Native people call the Battle of the Greasy Grass or the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is one of the, I think the only one by White Swan that exclusively shows scenes from that particular battle. They're a bit out of order, but in the upper right-hand corner, you see White Swan using a spotting scope and trying to scout out the camps. Then the bottom right-hand corner, you see White Swan killing an enemy while on horseback. The bottom left-hand corner, you see that his horse had been killed, and then he was wounded. And then he escaped by foot. You can see bloody footprints going up to the top, where he was again attacked and wounded even more. And then back on the far right-hand side, in the very center, you see a 7th Cavalry person with White Swan attached to a horse wall in the back. So these are 5 different battle scenes from that particular battle. So, but you can read them and you know who it is. And there's actually, I can't remember where, I think it's in the lower left-hand corner here, there's, will look kind of like a white turkey, but it's a White Swan. That was his name glyph. That was his signature to identify who made this work. But when you talk about these kind of narrative scenes, there certainly was a time when kind of battle or war exploits were the things that were primarily depicted, but it wasn't exclusively that, especially by the time that you get to the reservation era, and particularly when also people were in prison, say in Fort Marion in Florida, where some of the warriors who were in prison there would make and sell drawings like this that not only depicted their own war exploits, but also things like ceremony. And then one of the most common things that you get during the reservation era is instead of conquests of war, you have conquests of love. And so this actually became a very common theme that you find in works that are sometimes on ledger paper, but other times on other forms. Now, I mentioned before about how pictorial works tended to be more done by men, but not exclusively. This is Nellie Two Bear Gates, who famously created a mass amount of work, everything from kind of doctor's bags to pipe bags to gun cases, and it goes on and on. There's actually, in the exhibition that opens tonight, a work that's almost absolutely by the same artist. Now, it's not identified as Nellie Tuber Gates in the exhibition, because the one that's on the left here is attributed to her in the Denver Art Museum, but it's not definitive. And Joe and I were talking about this yesterday, that more research needs to be done to truly identify who the hand is. But it is important to note that, you know, everything is made by someone. And oftentimes that knowledge, when it was made and you know, sent out into a community, that knowledge was maintained. But oftentimes things that get into museums, you know, you'll sometimes see unrecorded artists, not just unknown artists, because at some point those artists were known, but whoever was the collector, whoever was a donor, maybe didn't find that information as important to maintain with the object itself, which created a separation between the artist who made it and the work itself. And that's ongoing work that museums and communities themselves are working together to try to rematriate that knowledge together. Now, taking from kind of like these winter counts and these ledger art and works, narrative works, you get into the 1920s, and here's a work by Stephen Mopope, who is a member of the Kiowa Six, who in the 1920s studied at the University of Oklahoma, and they were among the first indigenous artists to exhibit internationally. So in the late 1920s, they were exhibiting their work in Paris. What's also, gets kind of on a little bit of a sidebar, but you know, so you see the painting by Mopope on the right-hand side of an early version of what's now referred to as a fancy dancer. And you see Mopope and some of the other Kiowa Six members dressed, you know, and two or three of them were actually dressed as fancy dancers in the 1920s. But this is another thing that's really important to note, is that this was brand new at that time. In fact, it was originally called the Crazy Dance, and it was originally founded around 1921 or so by four men. There was Dennis Roughface, who you see pictured on the left. There was Henry Snake, Gus McDonald, all three of them Ponca, and Chester Left Hand, who was an Arapaho man. So four people whose names we know in around 1921 founded what's now the fancy dance. But you see from the 1920s to the 1950s to, you know, the 2000 teens, the evolution of the style. So this is also important to recognize in the arts, and it's not just Plains arts, it's all indigenous arts. There is a time when something is new and innovative, and then it's also iterative. And so taking that, you look at Lakota dresses over a 75-year period, and you see dramatic change, not only from the cut of the dress, but also the way that they are, the way that they're adorned. You know, and so this is a key fact that, you know, this is fashion, and in fashion, everything changes, and that is okay, that is the norm. And those ideas that people may have of, you know, a Plains male warrior wearing a feather headdress, you know, in a black and white photo, those are locked in moments in time that at that moment might have been cutting edge fashion, but it doesn't mean that 5, 10 years later it was, you know, the same thing. And those are important aspects to remember when looking at all indigenous arts, is that we can't lock them into a particular time point. I was talking earlier with Avis here, who's going to be speaking later, about kind of the ideas of, you know, what is traditional. Well, traditional to whom and to when? Those are concepts that we always have to tease out and to identify and clarify, because if we don't, we run the risk of locking a group of people into a particular aesthetic at a particular point in time. So, getting back to kind of this, you know, the flat style that that Stephen Mopope was working with, that had no depth, it had no context to the scene, you then start to see some changes. In the 1940s, which we'll talk about actually later on with Rick West, whose father actually created the painting that's on the right-hand side here, which definitely shows kind of depth to the scene. But what's also interesting is that the way that those people are sitting in this particular painting is the exact meaning of that moccasin design I showed earlier with those red and white kind of rounded stripes. It's the same image, but one is done in a pictorial way, one is done in an abstract way. And then you have works by like Oscar Howe, who's a Dakota artist, who he started working in a flat style with the Santa Fe Indian School back in the 1930s, and then he started kind of creating his own style. And at the time, people referred to it as he was kept abstracting the idea. So here you have this this dancer that is not portrayed in a very realistic way. It may seem more abstract, but Oscar Howe argued that nothing that he did was abstract, because if you had the cultural knowledge to decode it, you'd know exactly what he was doing. And so he even talked that every line meant truth, every swirl meant harmony. And he argued that any Lakota or Dakota person would know that if they saw his work. So again, even though ideas were kind of portrayed in abstract ways, the visual references really relied on cultural knowledge to be able to decipher. So then that gets us a little bit further into like the 1960s and 1970s. So I mentioned Oscar Howe. In 1958, he famously wrote a letter to the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because his work was rejected from an art competition for, quote, not looking Indian enough. And he argued, who are you to say if something is native or not? Interestingly, what you don't often hear about that story is that the people who actually declined it were other native judges. They were not actually people from the Philbrook who did it. But it led to this whole big kind of reckoning in the field. And so the very next year, in 1959, the Philbrook created a new category for quote unquote traditional or contemporary art. And then that also convened a group from the Rockefeller Foundation that brought people together, which a direct result of that was the founding of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe in 1962. Well, in 1964, Fritz Scholder becomes a painting instructor. Around the same time, T.C. Cannon, who you see here, is kind of doing work that has this level of social commentary. In this particular work, you see kind of these two grandmothers butchering an emaciated cow, which on kind of like this really confined set of land, which suggests the idea of like a boundary or or a reservation, and that they're like this gets into issues about rationing and about food allotments and whatnot, and kind of you see this dark storm in the background. So now we're getting into like social commentary in these works. Now bring it even further into the future. Here you have Terry Greaves, who is using beadwork and other media to depict stories that are meaningful to her community, the Kiowa community. And so here you have like the Double Boys, and there's references to the sun and the earth. There's references to I mentioned the winter counts earlier, that from Silverhorn, the Kiowa artist. You'll see a tree with leaves on it on one side and a tree with no leaves on it on the other side. There's also, you can't see it in this, but there's all these actual gold, like real gold and silver ants that Terry's sister Carrie Atumby casted that talk about the Kiowa creation story. So this is a modern representation or a contemporary representation of those stories. Then you get to this badass family who Jessa Ray will be talking today about her work, but her mom and her grandma are also with us here in, I don't know, we're in Burbank or Glendale right now. I don't know where we are. Somewhere in the rainy California. I don't know where I am. So I'm not going to get into this, but you see the title here I use, trans-customary. This is actually a term that is coined, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but he's a Maori scholar, and he basically argues that historical or traditional and contemporary, you can't use a binary. There's actually many more points on a spectrum that we can talk about this. And trans-customary refers to the use of historic media to do something kind of innovative and moving forward in today. And so it takes away the connotations that something quote unquote traditional might have on it, and frees the artists up to use these historic media, but in new and creative ways. Then again, traditional and contemporary, like what traditional to whom and to when, those terms aren't really helpful. And at the Denver Art Museum, we've been collecting indigenous arts for 100 years now. Things that we collected in the 1920s as cutting-edge contemporary art, like works by Marie and Julian Martinez, are now viewed as traditional arts. So the only difference between historical and contemporary art is that element of time, because everything that is now contemporary has the potential to become traditional. And so Deani Whitehawk is, in her work, if you don't know her work, she's absolutely incredible. She has a retrospective up right now at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And she incorporates the visuals and the philosophies of indigenous ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing into her work. And she incorporates beads, she incorporates painting and porcupine quill work, and brings it all together into kind of these, what some may consider to be abstract expressions. But the abstraction, it really comes down to context. If you have the knowledge to decode them, they're not so abstract themselves. So I think I have done it. What do you think? Did I... Thank you again, and back to Joe.